Hi, in this video, we will create this photo adjustment prototype and interaction using SwiftUI. We are going to create these interactions using interaction mapping or binding. So a change in the slider will also result in changing the properties of the photo. So let's get started. In order to map or bind a change in the slider to a change in the photo, we need to create a state. So over here, we are going to create all the states. So we have the first one to be blur, the next we have hue, contrast, opacity, brightness, and saturation. So by dragging each of the sliders, we are going to bind the change in the slider value to all these properties of the photo. So looking at this interface, we have the title, which is the text over here, a photo, which is this one, and all these text, which are the properties we want to change by using the slider. So let's start with the first one, which is blur. Over here, we are going to add a slider. A slider takes several parameters, but the most important ones we are going to use in this interaction design are value and in. The first one is value. The value parameter of the slider maps the change in the slider value to the property you want to change. So let's put value. That takes a binding. So the property we are going to change here is the blur intensity. So let's copy this one. So we have to pass this as binding by using the $sign. So you can see from the interface, we have added the slider. By dragging the knob, nothing happens because we need to bind this to the property we want to change. The next is the range. That is specified as in. So here I'm going to put the parameter in. The parameter in is the range for the slider. So we are going to use 0 to 10. When we drag the knob, you can see nothing happens. So what we have to do next is to use the state to change the property, which in this case is the blur property of the photo. So let's go to where we have the photo. This is the photo. So after the aspect ratio modifier, we are going to add the blur modifier. You can now see a blur intensity of 3.0 has been added to the photo. Let's change the value to, for example, 10. We now increase the intensity of the blur, but instead of setting this value to a hard-coded value, we are going to use the state. So let's copy the state without the $sign and replace the value. So now, as we drag the knob of the slider, we change the intensity of the blur of this photo. We can use the same process to add the interactivity to all these properties. So let's copy the slider over here and go to the next, brightness adjustment. Over here, we are going to add the slider. So let's change the state to brightness. That one is brightness adjust. For the range of the brightness, we will leave it as 0 to 1. So let's remove the 0 here. Next, we are going to use the state brightness adjust to change the brightness modifier. So let's go to where we have the photo. After the blur modifier, we are going to add the brightness modifier. Instead of setting the value to a hard-coded value, we are going to replace the value with the state. So now by dragging the knob of the brightness slider we change the brightness intensity of the photo. Next, let's go to the contrast. So we are going to copy this slider and go to the third point, which is the contrast. Over here, let's add the slider. Then we change the state to contrast. That is contrast adjust. The range of the contrast will be 0 to 1. What we have to do next is to copy the state and use it to change the value of the contrast modifier. Then we go to where we have the photo. Let's add the contrast modifier and paste the state. So we can now use the contrast slider to modify the photo as we drag from left to right. Let's go to the next, which is the saturation. We can copy any of the sliders and use it for the saturation. Then we change the state from contrast adjust to saturation. For the range of the saturation slider, we will leave it as 0 to 1. So let's copy the state and use it to change the value of the saturation modifier. After the contrast modifier, we're going to add saturation and paste the state here. So we can drag the saturation slider to change or modify the photo. Let's then go to the fifth one, which is rotate chroma. This is the same as hue adjustment. We use hue rotation in SwiftUI to change or rotate the color of an image. By using hue rotation, we have to specify an angle, and the angle of rotation starts from 0 to 360. So let's copy one of the sliders and use it for the fifth one, which is rotate chroma. For the state, we are going to change it to hue adjust. You can see here it is shown on the interface. By dragging the knob, nothing happens. So let's copy the state. We are going to use it to change the hue rotation of the photo. After the saturation modifier, we are going to add hue rotation. The hue rotation modifier takes an angle, and the angle can be in degrees or in radians. In our case, we are going to use degrees. So the angle of rotation needs to be a value from 0 to 360. Over here, we are not going to enter a hard-coded value. So we are going to paste the state. But nothing happens because the range is set to 1. Let's change it to, for example, 90. So that we have the angle of rotation set to 90. So now if we change it, you can see we rotate the color of the image. Additionally, we can specify the range for the hue rotation as red, green, and blue. 0 means red, 120 degrees means green, and 240 means blue. So if we change this to 0, that means we cannot drag the slider, but now we have the red color. Let's change it to 120. So now if we drag the slider, the maximum value will be green. If we change it to 240, we will have a blue color. So let's change the range from 0 to 240. If we drag the slider again. We change the photo to blue. Let's go to the next, which is the last one, transparency. We are going to copy one of the sliders and use it for the transparency. By scrolling up, we are going to use the state opacity adjust. So at this point, we will change the state to opacity adjust and copy the state. We are going to use it to change the opacity of the photo. So let's add the opacity modifier and paste the state. For the range of the opacity, it has to be 0 to 1. So let's change this range to 1. So by dragging the transparency slider to the left, we reduce the opacity to 0. So the photo becomes invisible on the screen. So this is how to create this photo adjustment prototype and interactions using interaction mapping along with sliders in SwiftUI.